I would like everyone to hear something of an echo from the past. It's the very words you're hearing right now in Washington. You're going to think that you're hearing things because it's the same identical thing that they said back at the time of the crash, at the time of the Great Depression. There was total shock in the United States when the stock market crashed, and the bankers got together and thought they had fixed the problem. And the message that came from Washington was the fundamentals, the economy is sound. Don't pay any attention to the stock market. I want you to hear what was said back at that time.
Grandfather and many others felt that the worst was over, but they were very, very wrong.
Over the weekend, the bankers' interventions seemed to have worked. Trading on Friday and Saturday was calm and uneventful. President Hoover also tried to steady nerves by repeating a mantra that has been used during market crashes many times since.
The fundamental business of the country, that is production and distribution of commodities, is on a sound and prosperous basis.
This is the same mantra that's being used right now, folks. The same mantra. The same exact words are coming from Washington. Now, sit with me and watch the story unfold, because that's what's about to happen again, but much worse. I don't know if you watched today, as just in the last few minutes, I sat and watched it as it went from 600 points negative down to 1,000 points, just like few minutes. All day had been sitting right around 600 and 700 points down. And I kept saying, you know what, I think that's going to get to 4% today. And surely it did. So let's go ahead and watch the rest of this together and see what's to unfold. Remember, this followed the mantra that is now being shouted from Washington, from Donald Trump.
But in the offices of the financial district, there was total chaos.
One of the things that we forget is how primitive the technology was. So many stocks traded on October 24th that it took 4 hours for the ticker to print all of the stock trades after the market had closed.
The ticker, hopelessly swamped, fell hours behind the actual trading and became completely meaningless. All night long, the lights blazed in the windows of the tall office buildings, where margin clerks and bookkeepers struggled with the desperate task of trying to clear one day's business before the next day began. They fainted at their desks. The weary runner fell exhausted on the marble floors of banks and slept.
On Monday, with stock tickers running out of tape, panicking investors desperate for the latest share prices jammed the telephone lines between New York and other major cities. For the first time, many speculators were discovering the downside of easy credit and buying on margin.
A fairly significant number of people who were buying stocks in the 1920s were buying it with borrowed money. And of course, the wonder of buying stocks with borrowed money is that the gains are tremendously accelerated and magnified on the way up. And then, of course, on the way down, the entire machinery is thrown into reverse, and the losses are also magnified.
All these people who had borrowed to buy stock now had to put up more collateral. And this was something that had not happened as the market had gone up and up. You've got $25 down for a $100 stock, but now the stock has dropped. So what happened is...
Now just think about a bond market. Think about all these people, all those that have their money in bonds. Right? What if they can't pay their bonds?
The brokerages that had made all these loans got very concerned that the loans wouldn't be paid back. People got calls to bring in more cash or their stocks would be sold.
Account needs $600. Unless this amount received before 1 p.m. Tuesday, will sell all securities in your account. Consider this notice to that effect.
And that's a difficult thing to do. Some people didn't have additional cash to bring in, or they took them some time perhaps to do it, but the brokers were very uneasy. They couldn't wait. And so Monday, the market begins to fall even at a steeper rate than it fell on Thursday. In fact, this would turn out to be one of the very worst days ever in the history of the United States stock market.
In 1929, when the stock market crashed, I was a very young lady, just 7 years old. However, I do remember bits and pieces of that day very clearly in my memory. We didn't have many means of communication. And when something extraordinary happened, the papers would put out an extra, that's what it was called, an extra for 2 cents. And the little boys in their little pea caps would come running through the streets screaming, "Extra, extra, read all about it." And invariably somebody in the house would go down and buy a daily for 2 cents, and then we would know what happened. And that's how we found out about the crash.
At the time, Vera was with a family friend. But news came that the friend's aunt had lost everything.
The little lady was crying quietly. She was crying quietly and wringing her hands and walking from room to room to room. So that was my actual memory of that day.
On Tuesday morning, some of the most famous names in corporate America saw their share price plummet. U.S. Steel, Radio, General Motors, stocks that had been symbols of the boom years.
On Tuesday, there were tremendous waves of selling that just kept coming. This time, the selling was so powerful and so relentless, there was no lunchtime meeting at J.P. Morgan. Clearly, the volume of the sales overwhelmed any possibility of the bankers trying to stem the tide.
By evening Tuesday, all American stocks were worth about 22% less than they were when the market opened in the morning on Monday. 36 hours, you lost 22% of the value of American industry.
Hoover was president, and he and Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, were way to the right and felt that it was not the government's job to interfere with this. They believed in pure, unfettered capitalism, and so they did very little or nothing to alleviate the crash. They said it'll solve itself. The market broke very sharply, and a lot of people were wiped out with it. It was very painful. Almost everybody lost money, as has happened now.
Oh, the market's not so good today. Your stocks look kinda sick. In fact, they all drop down a point each time the tickers tick.
It's estimated that by the end of these 5 days trading, $25 billion worth of personal wealth had simply disappeared.
The stock market continues to sag without end. Have orders in to sell everything. I figure I'll have about 500 left if I'm lucky. A humble ending to a potential profit not 4 months ago of nearly 100,000. At least, I say to myself, I lost all in the greatest panic in history.
I was very lucky. I never lost my job. I did get a cut in salary. Fortunately, my employers were wealthy people. And when they told me about this, they said, why are you smiling? I said, I thought you were going to fire me.
Those who could afford to faced their losses with black humour.
I am one of the lambs that Wall Street has shorn. When I was a little girl, a patron of art left me $1 million for my musical education. But I thought I couldn't live on the income from $1 million. So I asked all my rich friends for tips on the market. They gave them to me, and I lost my million. Now the only thing I have left is this chinchilla coat of mine. From now on, my hands are off the ticker and on the piano keys. But if you're lucky enough to have $1 million, hold everything and don't play the market.
Another performer who had gambled and lost was Groucho Marx. His reckless speculation cost him everything he'd earned. The fate of Alice Austin, the photographer from Staten Island, was also typical of those who had been lured into the market without realizing the risks.
Basically, she loses everything. In 2930, her account is wiped out. And it comes as a shock for Alice Austin. And I don't think she believes it. Like a lot of people, you just can't believe it. And she thinks all I have to do is to wait a little bit and the market will come back. And
I want you all to think about something. When you have any percentage lost, like it was today, almost 4%, yeah, that's not going to affect the rich, right? That's not going to affect them at all. That's just pocket. That's not even pocket change for them. But when you've got people, the regular people out there that are investing in the stock market, like they are, like a gambling casino, hoping they're going to get a return on their money, losing even 1% is a lot of money. And today there was wealth lost, okay? And that's going to affect the economy, whether they say it doesn't or not. But what you're listening to in the media right now, what you're listening to, that is those that have plenty of money that, yeah, they've lost wealth, but not a whole lot. And they just say, oh, well, this is okay. In fact, they're saying it'd be good to have a correction. Well, there are people that are losing a lot of money right now, and that's not being talked about. And so that's what happened back then. It didn't affect the millionaires and the billionaires. It affected the average person during the Depression. And that's what the Depression was all about. It wasn't about the mega rich. It wasn't, they continued to party, just like they do in this time. You have a housing bubble, and they get bailed out, and they continue to party. Well, that's what's happening now. And Donald Trump being a billionaire with all his billionaire friends, if he is a billionaire, they're just going to continue to party. They're going to continue to spin it in the media that everything's fine, and they're going to continue the mantra that our economy's fine and fundamentals are great. So, but because there are so many so many millionaires in this country now. There are more rich people now because of the last 10 years where they've just been living high on the hog, and it's just been a bull market. But now we're coming into a bear market. I mean, folks, it's going to get grisly. You understand what I'm saying to you? So remember, it's the poor. It's the middle class. It's these people that are going to be affected by what's going on right now in the stock market. But you're not going to hear about that in the media because the media is spun to, say that everything's fine because it is for the rich. Continue to listen.
And she continued living as if she was rich. And Alice Ocean mortgaged her house, not to pay her bills, but because she once again wanted to take a fancy trip to Europe.
My father lost everything. He was losing everything, but he was 22. He took it magnanimously. You know, when you're 22, it isn't as dramatic. The people around him who were, established people in their 50s and 60s and were losing their life savings were in an absolute panic.
Not everyone coped with their losses. Although the number of suicides has been exaggerated, to some, it seemed the only way out.
I know that people read about the stories on Wall Street of people opening the windows in their offices and jumping out. That actually happened. That isn't an urban legend. People did commit suicide. People who had worked 30 and 40 years on Wall Street and had amassed fortunes within a period of days lost everything.
I'm sorry I was unable to return the 2 books until now. The conditions down in the financial neighborhood have been such as to keep us working. Yesterday, a woman jumped from the roof of our building, 44 floors, right past our window. I saw her body lying in the street, and the sight was so harrowing that I became half sick.
The effects of the catastrophic crash on Wall Street rippled out across America. Even those who had never owned shares and who had never benefited from the stock market boom became victims too. The crash had undermined Americans' faith in their fragile banking system, made up of thousands of small-town banks that lacked the size or reputation to convince customers that their money was safe. As confidence in the economy sank further, a domino effect began. In 1931, over 2,000 banks failed.
After the crash, the banks closed. That, I think, affected us a little more seriously, us, meaning us, the people of my stature. Many people had money in the bank, little bit of money, a couple of $100, $1,000 maybe.
There was no infrastructure then. There was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to guarantee people's deposits. There was no way to back up the banks. So if the banks had made bad choices, you as a depositor paid for it. You went to go get your money, it wasn't there. And then people would hear that the bank down the street wasn't good, and they worried about their own bank, and then that would cause a run on their bank. And it became a terrible, vicious cycle. And something like 3,000 banks closed in the following couple of years after that. The whole financial system then seemed not just unstable, but worthless.
After that, when people saved money, they were very leery of banks, and money went under the mattress.
The stock market crash in 1929 did not create the Great Depression, but it did start a sequence of events that eventually culminated with the Great Depression.
Well, some of this is going to sound sort of familiar. The banks were loaning money for the stock market, the companies were loaning money, the brokerages were loaning money, and when those prices fell, all that money just disappeared. Almost immediately, companies began to feel the pinch of not having the capital and of having lost money, and they began to lay off people, to let people go, to shut down production.
There were mass bankruptcies. There was a liquidity crisis of exactly the same kind we have today. That is to say, all kinds of businesses could no longer get loans to keep themselves afloat, even if those businesses were entirely solvent. They couldn't get the kind of short-term commercial credit to pay their workers, to buy new inventory, to pay their suppliers. And so they began going back.
You remember during the housing bubble how the banks closed up and wouldn't give out money? How they wouldn't loan people money? Folks, the housing bubble was a warning of what's coming. It's absolutely inevitable. It is coming. That's what the housing bubble was, just one of the many bubbles. But I mean, if the banks wouldn't give out loans, and it's still, they just recently started opening their but they have been very, very stingy since the housing bubble, the housing crisis. But the only thing, let me tell you, the only thing that has staved off it getting any worse under Obama was the fact that the Fed was printing money out of thin air, that they were constantly using quantitative easing, and they kept on putting money and putting money and putting money. Well, that bubble has been handed over to Trump now, and Trump doesn't know what to do with the bubble. He doesn't know what to do. He knows what it is to run a business or whatever, but he doesn't know what it is to run a country. And obviously the people working with him don't know how to run a country. And so they've got this volatile bubble now, and what are they going to do with it? And that's the mess that we're in right now. So if there is a run on the banks, which is the phrase that I received this morning when I woke up, then we're right back in the same position that we're watching right now in this video. It's just a cycle. It's like an echo from the past.
Bankrupt. And as they went bankrupt, they laid people off. And as they laid people off, demand fell. And this is what does traumatic damage to the whole society. So traumatic that it's second only to the Civil War in American memory as a tragic moment in American history.
My father had a modest-sized insurance brokerage agency. One night at dinner, my father said that he had to fire an employee. And I very cavalierly said, well, he'll be able to get a job, won't he? And my father said, no. He's an older man who isn't very capable, and I don't think he can. And at that point, my father burst into tears. It was the first time I had ever seen my father cry.
There was such a change in our lives and all the people around me after the crash. Many of my girlfriend's fathers lost their jobs, and they couldn't pay the rent. They were evicted. The poverty was really all around us. Men had no clothing. They were in rags, really rags. They used to wrap their feet up in newspaper and put them in cardboard, makeshift shoes to walk around the street. And then if you took a walk over to Central Park, you saw this big area, a deserted reservoir that had been drained. And they made little huts of cardboard boxes, and they would sleep there overnight. And they called it Hooverville, because that was the name of our president at the time. And of course, all this stock market crash and all this poverty was, of course, put in his lap.
Now just think about the tent cities all over the United States right now. Is that Trumpville? I guess that should be called Trumpville.
It was really, really pitiful.
Like many others, the photographer Alice Austin struggled to keep up mortgage payments as the Great Depression took hold.
A few years into the Depression, Alice Austin runs out of money. There is nothing left. She's out of her house. They take her to a poorhouse, and it's a poorhouse out of a Dickens novel, and she lingers there for a couple of years. Miraculously, her photographs are discovered. A few of her photos are sold to Time and Life magazine, and that earns her enough money to move out of the poorhouse and into a decent retirement home. In a sense, her photographs come to her rescue and take her out of poverty and into a year or two of decent living.
Paul Warburg, who so accurately predicted the crash and the depression, saved the bank he ran from disaster by getting out of the market in time. But it was of little consolation to him.
My great-grandfather probably never really recovered his own personal equilibrium after the crash. To be called the Cassandra of Wall Street, I think was very painful for him. And if we all remember Cassandra, she couldn't just see the future, she was also doomed to be disregarded. And I think it caused him to go into a depression of his own. I'm not sure that he ever would have said, "I told you so." I think he felt that it was really tragic, that this worldwide depression could have been averted or headed off, or at least it didn't have to crash so hard. And I think it probably led to his early death. When he died, it was the last year of Hoover's presidency, and there was no end in sight.
But in 1932, 12 years of Republican rule came to an end.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Democrat Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in a landslide victory. His first task was to restore confidence.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Seen as a savior, Roosevelt promised a new deal for the American people and to regulate the financial system.
There must be a strict supervision of all banking and credit and investment. There must be an end to speculation with other people's money.
Now, this is where the Federal Reserve came into being. This is what he meant by regulating the banks and all of this. This was all the Rothschilds. They brought all this in, central bank into the United States, and that's the way we've been ever since, under the control of the Rothschilds and the international bankers, central banks, and this is what's continuing globally right now, and that's why we're getting ready to go into war with Syria and into Iran and what's going on over there, because they want to bring the whole world under their central banks and a world bank. So we're just seeing this all over again, people. It's going to be worse, though, than the Depression. I want to make a note, too, that during the Great Depression, it wasn't so bad as it was, in the inner cities, as it was in the outer laying, as far as out in the country, in Virginia, the people out there, as you will see, obviously the Waltons, kind of hyped that up a little bit in the movie. Probably wasn't that bad, maybe, but this, that was during that era, during the time when Nazi Germany and all of that was going on in World War II. And so I do believe they saw that it worked back there to bring World War II, and so they're following the same strategy, bringing the crash again so they can bring us to World War III. It worked before, why not do it again, right? That seems to me. But you have those today that think they're smarter and they can learn from the past, and they think, well, we'll just invest in gold now. Or let me tell you, it's like I preached in my previous message. The shaking that is coming, and we're in the end. This is the end. This is the last of the last days. It's all coming to an end. So it's not going to be any recovery. It's just going to wax worse and worse. Perilous times are here. It's not going to get any better, people. It's eventually the roller coaster ride is going to plummet. And When it's all said and done, Russia and China will begin to take over. And so, anyway, let me let you finish up watching the rest of this.
The new president acted quickly. He guaranteed bank deposits and introduced laws forcing bankers to operate under strict government supervision. An investigation into the crash was launched by the Senate Banking Committee. It would last more than 3 years, and the 10,000 pages of testimony blackened the reputation of Wall Street. The committee's ambitious lawyer, Ferdinand Pecora, challenged the banking elite to account for their behavior.
He calls these bankers to testify. And what does he learn? He learns that Charlie Mitchell of National City Corp had sold stock to his wife to avoid taxes. Richard Whitney, who had so boldly bought stock on Black Thursday, lost money of his own and began borrowing from his brother. And then when that didn't work, he began stealing from customers. He ended up in jail doing time.
The most prestigious bank in America, J.P. Morgan, was also found to be far from blameless. The hearings uncovered evidence of a list that offered preferential deals on stocks to friends in high places, including a former president.
Not only Morgan partners and Morgan family members, but also prominent corporate executives and even some politicians. Calvin Coolidge was on the preferred stock list, for example. That was a practice that a lot of people felt was wrong.
Ferdinand Pecora had a great quote. He said it was shocking disclosures of low standards in high places, which I love because, you could say the same thing today.
In response to public outrage at the bankers' dirty dealings, President Roosevelt set up the Securities and Exchange Commission. Its task, to clean up Wall Street. At its head, he chose a man who knew more about unethical practice than most.
President Roosevelt, when he introduced the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate Wall Street, named his old friend and supporter Joe Kennedy to be the first chairman. And that's putting the fox in the chicken coop.
Although Roosevelt restored confidence in the banking system, the Great Depression would last until the outbreak of World War II. Then, as now, the globalized economy meant that the crash and subsequent depression rippled out across the world. In Britain, there was a slump in manufacturing, and millions lost their jobs. Germany, still suffering from defeat in the First World War, was hit even harder.
So many people had their life savings destroyed during the Great Depression that it created in many countries a desire for some authoritarian government that would save them, that would rescue the economy.
No doubt the crash and the Depression strengthened anti-capitalist movements. The communists had taken over in Russia, and there were rising fascist movements. Mussolini was already in power in Italy, and Hitler's political base was growing in Germany. And when American-style free market capitalism suffered from this Wall Street crash followed by a depression, it just strengthened those people who wanted to say, there's a better way.
While communism and fascism prospered, many nations put up barriers to prevent free trade and turned inwards in an attempt to save their economies. Economic nationalism led to trade wars and later, World War.
Did I hear that correctly? Did he say trade wars? That's exactly what's going on right now. And what did it lead to? World War. There you have it. Following the same exact path. We are headed to World War III. And before that can happen, there's got to be another crash. It's got to be.
80 years on, those who remember the bubble of the 20s and the crash that followed feel that they have seen it all before.
I don't think we learned anything from it. I have found that people's memories are very short. They make the same type of leveraged commitments where they don't look at the downside risk.
You have a lot of cheap credit in the 1920s. Now we've had cheap credit and people have speculated in houses, and now the housing bubble has collapsed.
You have a heavily leveraged American consumer. He's in debt up to his eyeballs, and he can't sustain that debt. The subprime mortgage crisis is a symptom of that.
In the 80s and 90s, faith in the free market had revived, and as optimism returned, many of the financial regulations which Roosevelt had introduced were felt to be outdated and were slowly dismantled. Yet again, a lightly regulated market allowed speculation to grow unchecked.
We are now reaping the whirlwind of that deregulation, and in that sense, we're in exactly the same position as people were in 1929 when the government turned a blind eye to what was going on in the financial world.
Do you remember what the scripture says? They that sow to the wind reap the whirlwind. And he just said that the deregulation led to a whirlwind. Well, that's what Donald Trump has promised to do. That's what he's doing. That's what the tax cuts were. That's what all this is deregulation. It's going to lead to the same thing, people.
What I do hope and I do think is that the government has learned its lessons and is trying to take steps that are much more active and much more aggressive than what was taken in the 30s to try and stem the pain and stem the decline.
The hope is that such steps will work. But the lessons from the crash of 1929 are that history repeats itself, that human folly and greed are much stronger forces in financial affairs than reason and restraint.
Isn't that true? Where there's greed, there will always be these conditions. There will always be volatility. Always. So, end on that note. You know, he mentioned how people have bad memories. They forget, you know. And then this woman says, well, maybe we'll learn from, my hope is that we'll learn from the past. Well, I wouldn't hold your breath. Remember the message I just shared with you in the previous message. I would be looking to be a part of this if I were you. Revelation 19, verse 14. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations. He shall rule them with a rod of iron, and he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness of the wrath of Almighty God. He hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. God bless you.